Mostly just going to be doing a general breakdown and overview of the top 5 hunters for team fights versus the top 5 hunters for laning phase. Some of them might even end up, toggling in between the two. I think that there's definitely some hunters that are both pretty strong in the laning phase and can also have really strong team fights, but I think for right now, the main emphasis here that I want to make is to definitely just distinguish and kind of clarify the difference between team fighting hunters versus laning phase hunters so that you guys back at home could maybe get a little bit of a better idea of how to actually position yourself throughout the mid, early, and late game. So, first things first, we'll be looking at the team fighting hunters to begin with. I think by far one of the best team fighting hunters right now that we're looking towards, that I think we can expect to see a lot of in competitive play as well, is going to be Kernanos. I bring up Kernanos largely because with his recent buffs and his Bramble Blast now doing a little bit more damage, I think that this god has a relatively safe laning phase, but more importantly, the team fighting aspects that I really have to highlight here comes from his Wild Hunt. That's his ultimate ability. And it's the fact that Kernanos can kind of force a team to reset on a big objective like the Gold Fury, like the Pyromancer, like the Fire Giant. Why I view this as being such an ideal ability. I think that we have kind of seen a shift in competitive play where nowadays you're starting to see more and more hunters kind of rise up when they have a little bit more of that team fighting control. And Cardinals, despite the fact that he doesn't have any CC immunity within his kit, I think that his boxing capabilities in close range makes him a strong candidate for team fights. His passive giving him that like cleave strike on top of the boosted damage, and if you're in summer stance, especially, you might be able to put in some nasty damage. Runeforge is also an incredibly popular build pathway right now for Kurtanos, and if you sit in winter stance, you're definitely going to be able to keep procking that Runeforge damage non-stop. Bramble Blast, like I already mentioned, it's got strong laning potential, as well as the fact that it gives you a root duration for 1 second if you're accurate with it. And in team fights, especially, this ability can be really strong because it can help your team to isolate one member of the enemy team, especially if you're looking to give chase. So I think that between Bramble Blast, Kern's passive, and the ability for him to like deal more damage based on whether he wants to toggle between summer stance or winter stance, all of those factors make him a really, really strong hunter for the team fights. I definitely am expecting to see a lot of this guy in season 6. I don't think it's a meme anymore. I think Kurtanos is actually going to be the GOAT in season 6. And like I already said, the Wild Hunt, that ult alone, I think, is really strong at just forcing that initial disengagement. And when you force the reset, the enemy team has probably already burned a decent amount of cooldowns trying to secure those objectives, which makes it a priority period for your team to then go in immediately after this ult has been opened up. Because even if it doesn't hit anybody, like I said, not only do you get the force reset, but you also get the possibility of forcibly separating the enemy team. A lot of times at a competitive level of play, teams try to stay as grouped on each other as possible because they don't want to leave their carries by themselves. Otherwise, it becomes really easy for one team to then just smother that carry and then just continue moving on through the team, like one by one, kind of like dominoes. Which is, again, just more reasoning behind why I think Kernos is going to be a top tier, or probably one of the best team fighting hunters. So he's going to be the number one that we're going to cover out of our 5 hunter choices. Next up after that, though, goes without saying, we're talking about ults and team fights, so Shiva Lanka has to come into the discussion. Shiva Lanka's ultimate, Darkest of Nights, has always been regarded, I think, by the majority of the pro scene as probably one of, if not the best ultimate in the game. And it's just because of the simple fact that it kills all communications for 3 seconds. And not necessarily that, every single SPL team, like all the players are going to stop talking all at once, but it's that they don't know what's happening. You can't see in front of themselves. And when you don't have any vision for 3 seconds, it might not seem that long in real time, but in the game, especially surrounding objective play, this ult is really difficult to fight around, and it will almost always force a reset on an objective, at least the big ones like Gold Fury and Fire Giant. Pyromancer's kind of debatable based on which team feels they have better positioning, but Darkest of Nights gives you a lot of leverage in the team fights because as soon as it's applied, Shibalanke not only gets the extended auto range, but your team can then look to smother one of the enemy team's carries or even one of their tanks. It's been pretty popular lately, at least towards the end of Season 5, especially at World. Spliced was one of the number one teams that was looking to kill the front line, and Darkest of Nights will almost always be able to help a team isolate a frontlining member, and if your team is then able to smother them, bring them down. That makes the rest of the team fight much easier to handle. So, in general, Shibalanke's ultimate is just so self-explanatory that you've probably already been seeing a decent amount of Shibalanke in your rank games. And the reasoning being, like I said, the game has started to take a little bit more direction towards these big team fighting objectives, especially with the new gold theories now being introduced. Having a different gold theories to fight over could also help teams, I think, better decide as to whether or not they want to try and look to initiate with Darkest of Nights. But this is an ability where it doesn't really matter if you're initiating a team fight with it or bringing it to close out or even somewhere in the middle of a team fight. I think that all in all, you can just never go wrong with having forced darkness on your opposition because their comms are going to be crazy. They're not going to know what's happening. And getting additional movement speed plus additional attack range and a possible stun is very scary stuff to try and deal with. Looking a little bit deeper into the rest of Shibalanke's kit, you're mostly just going to be looking to play around Poison Darts and Rising Jaguar. The AoE spread on his escape, it doesn't necessarily have to be used as an escape. I think that's something that's kind of neat about Shibalanke. You can be aggressive with Rising Jaguar, but I like to look more so towards Poison Darts because of the slow. Poison and like the slow, like the dot tick damage over time is really cool for Shibalanke because if you're able to slow your enemies while Darkest of Nights is being applied, they're gonna have a tough time, I think, trying to immediately escape. So one thing that I like to do personally, whenever I'm looking and I know that a team fight's about to break out, I try to apply poison darts first to as many people in the close vicinity or and that are as close in the area as possible, and then that way I can just immediately toss out the Darkest of Nights because when Darkest of Nights comes out, everybody has a tendency to like try and scatter from the enemy team. They look to reset upon each other and make sure that they stay closely grouped. But if you apply that slow while they're all trying to focus on escaping, then it makes it a little bit easier for your team to also then give pursue and look to break down the team fight from whichever carry or frontlining member of the enemy team gets left behind. Um, so that covers Shibalanki, I think, for one of the secondary better team fighting hunters in Smite. And then a third team fighting hunter that I wanted to bring about, I think, is a really interesting one because we did see a little bit of Medusa in season 5. I think that it was actually a pretty prevalent pick for Space Station, especially Barracuda. Really liked having Medusa because there was a lot of focus around crowd control at the time. And one thing that I like about Medusa when it comes to team fights is that in the right compositions, especially compositions that are very heavy in crowd control, Petrify becomes a very threatening ult, not necessarily because of the stun, but because of that movement speed slow as well. 40% for a 3-second duration is pretty steep. A lot of times, if you're at the point where you've got full points into your ultimate, everybody's level 20, especially when I'm referencing competitive play here, I think that Petrify is awesome to have for that 3-second 40% slow duration. Medusa also being a hunter that I think you can afford to buy Runeforge pattern on right now. This is only going to further boost her damage with that type of build. And finally, the damage. The damage is pretty steep on this ability, especially if you can catch them off guard. I think that Medusa, especially with how many awkward team fights tend to take place in competitive play, because it's hard to full on commit to an objective if they got a competitive level without expecting the enemy team to come in and try to disrupt that initial pool of the objective. So a Medusa ult, I think, is an ability that you can kind of afford to hold on to slightly longer than others. I think that when you're looking at the other hunters like Shibalanke and like Kernanos, there's usually a little period of time where you can kind of tell when it's best to use that ultimate. But with Petrify, I think that you can hold on to this as long as possible. Even if you want to hold on to it to help yourself try and self-peel for escape, I definitely think that Medusa is just, I don't want to say undervalued, but she didn't have the success that I think SSG in particular was looking for with her in season 5, but with the shifts that are taking place right now into season 6 and the laning phase maybe becoming a little bit more safe for hunters, I definitely think Medusa's a strong bet, and she's also someone that I'll be, breaking it down a little bit or going a little bit more into detail, but I think she's also a really strong laning phase hunter. She does a lot of damage right off the bat. Whether you choose to go with the Transcendence, Runeforge, or Devo's base type build with her, I think that Medusa just does so much damage alone with her Acid Spray and her Viper shots. Lacerate as well is a great tool for playing extremely aggressive during the laning phase and team fights if need be. But I mostly just really enjoyed the Petrify. I am hoping to see a little bit more Medusa in season 6. I definitely don't think that she's picked enough right now for everything that she offers. One of the main reasons for that probably being the fact that she's a little bit easier to punish currently in the laning phases, the way that junglers and mid laners are with having more levels and items usually by the time they end up going to gank the dual lane. Except, like I mentioned, with the shifts that are now taking place and dual lane maybe possibly becoming a safer environment for hunters, I think that Medusa has a lot of opportunities to not only bully the laning phase, but also look to bully that early to mid game. One slight downside, though, is that she does have a tendency to fall off a little bit in the late game because, as I mentioned earlier, Lacerate is a little bit of an easier ability to punish and like trap her. It's as a dash based hunter, it's very hard for dash based hunters to escape without the assistance of their teammates, especially at a competitive level. So positioning is key, of course, on Medusa, but I'll always like the fact that if there's a Medusa on the enemy team, including in a competitive environment, if there's a Medusa on the enemy team, you're normally going to see pros and players alike trying to be careful and mindful about which direction they're facing, and that could alter the enemy team's positioning. And I think when a hunter can influence the enemy team's positioning because of the threat that she poses with Petrify, that's always going to be a really strong team fighting factor to keep in mind, and kind of an unintentional one, but it still takes place. So that's just further better things for Medusa to have in her kit. So she's going to be the third hunter that I have to cover here. Fourth up, I think it goes without saying, Chernabog, man. All down to the ultimate again here though with the Chernabog. I've touched on this before in my other video about the hunters that I'm predicting to be top 5 for season 6 competitive play. But one thing that I really like about Chernabog and this Living Nightmare is that there is a slow that's applicable on his ultimate. So even if you're not intending to join the team fight, you can still slow the enemy team. And it's a 4% slow that can stack like 4 times. And it's just like, it's really annoying when an enemy team is when you're like watching your teammates brawl against the opposition, and then all of a sudden they're slowed while they're trying to give chase to your team, or where they're trying to like counter engage on your team. And so I think that the slow is a really strong factor. I think that you can use this ultimate whether you intend to join the team fight or not. So that's one of the main reasons why I also have to bring up Chernabog for this discussion. And if you do decide to join the party, I mean, damage mitigation going upwards to 30% is pretty insane for a hunter because you're dealing a ton of damage as soon as you land. AoE damage on his auto attacks, as long as you're able to proc 3 of them together, I think that makes it dangerous for the enemy team to try and group up on each other. Plus, most of the time, you're going to see some kind of mixture between Crystallized Curses and the Vicious Barrage, because you can either look for the root, or you can just straight up go for the attack speed. 60%, that's a pretty incredible steroid to have on Chernabog. I'm definitely a fan of the attack speed when you factor in that he also gets this AoE spread on Heart of Cold if you're accurate, and the ability to hide inside of the wall in case things do go south into darkness. This could possibly just delay a team fight long enough from somebody from your team to come back into the engagement. And that's just another reason why I definitely value Chernabog when it comes to team fighting capabilities. The fact that a hunter can be so tanky yet so damaging is very threatening, and Chernabog's probably one of the hunters who has an easier time bringing down those tanky objectives like the Fire Giant, Enhanced Fire Giant, It could be incredibly frustrating, I think, for a lot of teams when they're trying to full commit to an objective, but then the next thing they know, they've got a Chernabog flying into the battle just to cause a little bit of a ruckus. Because one thing I have seen players do as well in ranked matches, even they'll ult into the fire giant pit before their team even arrives there, and then they go into the wall, and you're still threatening presence inside of the wall. So sometimes you can even encourage an enemy team to drop an objective entirely with this ultimate alone, and by showing presence. And so that's one of the reasons, or I think that's probably my primary reasoning behind Chernabog being such a strong team fighting hunter, is that this ultimate is just, it's just crazy. I mean, you can be wherever you want to be on the map, and that's just something that you can never really go wrong with as a carry. Um, and last but not least, this might strike you guys a little bit by surprise, but I feel like it's necessary to bring her back into the discussion. Artemis. Right now, with the current state of hunters being able to toggle between decision making on Transcendence commitment builds, Devo commitment builds, or Runeforge commitment builds, I think that all of these things have definitely brought Artemis back into discussion of possibly being a top team fighting hunter in season 5, or at least she's the 5th one that I wanted to cover. And of course, a lot of it's got to come down to Tusky. Good old Tusky on Artemis's board. Artemis has a lot of self-peel in her kit, primarily because of the fact that she has no real escape. She gets a little bit of boost in movement speed off of her Vengeful Assault, and a slow that she can apply from Suppress the Insolent, but even then, these tools alone usually aren't enough to get her out of dodge. Typically, you're going to see an Artemis player trying to just drop their boar right away if they feel threatened, but at competitive levels of play, and especially with the shifts that are taking place over in dual lane, I think that there is potential for Artemis to rise yet again through the hunter ranks and become a threatening factor yet again from the physical hunter side of things, because the boar is just such a heavy interrupt factor. You can't do an objective with the Tusky just spinning from teammate to teammate, because even if you full commit to the Gold Fury or to the Fire Giant and you secure it, you run the risk of your team getting wiped in return. And that's why it's never safe to try and all-in commit when there's an Artemis on the enemy team. I can't tell you how many times I have watched teams wipe surrounding Gold Furies, Pyromancers, or Fire Giants, because, again, at competitive levels of play, pros and other high-ranking players, they tend to try and stick together as a group, because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to group up. But it can work against you if there's, an Artemis on the board, because then she just presses 4 and suddenly everybody's getting CC'd or stunned for upwards of 1.5 seconds. And the board sticks around for 6 seconds. So say somebody from the enemy team didn't realize that the Artemis had already ulted, and then they try to come into the fight like 4 seconds after it begun, they're still going to get hit by the board. And that brief interrupt could be the gap that your team needed in order to punish even further. And I am honestly hoping to see a little bit of Artemis again in season 6. I know the pros probably aren't too keen on her, because after she was so nutty in season 5, I think that they had their high time of fun with Artemis in season 5. They definitely were asking Ajax for quite a long time for some nerfs to Artemis, but I think it's right around time that she started to rise up again. And another reason why I think that I would recommend Artemis for a top 5 hunter in team fights is because at competitive levels of play, you are going to have synergy, you are going to have effective comms. Everybody's typically going to be on the same page as each other. I mean, that's why they're pros and they get paid to do this. And so I can definitely see Artemis working her way back into the competitive meta with the current shifts that are taking place from dual lane. And that's going to cover the 5 hunters that I think are best for team fighting right now. Mostly looking at it, like I mentioned, from the competitive aspect as opposed to a ranked or casual perspective, but I still think that the list can be applicable and still applies for sure at ranked and casual levels of play if you wanted to try those hunters out. But for as far as laning phase hunters are concerned, there's a few that are definitely going to come to mind. And first things first, I'm just going to jump into it. Uller. Uller's going to be the first hunter I bring up for laning phase because he's just mad aggressive. I mean, 9 times out of 10, you're going to see an Uller level up their one first because Bladed Arrow, Thrown Axe, that's where your poke potential comes from during the laning phase as Uller. You can have a little bit of survivability if you want to go for the Hail of Arrows slash Glory Bound, but getting your escape first isn't really necessary on Uller. A lot of times, if you're picking Uller, it's probably because you have a more aggressive support by your side, and you're just going to want to be able to hold that W key down so you can just chase down the enemy duo lane and look to pressure them out early on and then go for a purple buff invade. The one being able to hit every single creep in the wave is ideal, and not only that, being able to throw out the axe for the enemy's duo as they're trying to clear your creep wave can also bring those minions like the archers, and they'll come forward to the melee range, making it significantly easier for your duo lane pairing with Uller and whatever support you might have to finish clearing that wave before the enemy team. Um, and just the damage that Uller can put out as well. Uller's damage is very steep. This god was intended to do well in the early to mid games. He can fall off a little bit from mid to late, but I don't even really like to say that Uller falls off from mid to late. I think that he just becomes more of a setup based hunter as opposed to being the star carry that you were looking for in the mid to early game. So Uller, just the fact that he has so many abilities that can deal damage, even his stim, I think getting physical power or movement speed, depending on which stance you want to proc first. A lot of people tend to proc both at the same time also. Um, I think that it's just really really good ways to pressure out the early game, and there's already so much emphasis as well surrounding early game as far as invades are concerned, and being able to pressure out that initial Gold Fury Pyromancer spawn. I think that it's one of the main reasons why we have to bring Uller into a discussion for being a top laning phase hunter. Next up for laning phase, I've also touched on this guy a couple of times before, but if you're looking purely for laning phase clear, I think it's hard to go wrong with Rom. Those 5 astral arrows are like one of the main reasons why I think Rom is such a safe laning phase hunter. Um, Especially at competitive levels of play, because astral arrows plus whatever hunt or support you're with, you're going to be able to at least clear that first wave and then immediately choose to go to your purple buff and safely drop your purple buff. And that is why I think that you can't really go wrong with Rom at a competitive level of play. A lot of times when you see Rom get picked in pro league play, you'll see a very early game based hunter that is then usually brought in afterwards because they're looking to try and punish the ROM after that initial wave spawn. And as long as you're safe with your positioning and you kind of just play like a scaredy cat the entire time and hug your tower line, you can usually get Rom to a stage where by the time he hits the mid game, he's also going to be a super threatening team fighting hunter. And that's why I think it's interesting, because Rom wasn't in, my top 5 for team fighting hunters, but he's definitely still up there when it comes to team fighting hunters. And while I think that he's really strong throughout the laning phase, I think that he's also pretty useful if you can get him into the team fighting aspects as well. But yeah, just really wanted to emphasize astral arrows are A or they're S tier when it comes to clearing out waves, man. I love astral arrows and how strong they are at taking down that first creep wave. And again, this is all being factored in under the assumption that with the shifts that are taking place as well, heading into season 6 with dual lane, that this is also going to allow Rom to, I think, prosper a little bit more so. Um, Next up after Rom, we've got our boy Apollo. Early pressure is the name of the game right now in Smite, and you've probably already been seeing a little bit of this guy's surface as well. But we're looking at Apollo's passive here. The audacity and getting this stim after the 10 successful basic attacks and increasing your attack speed by 100%, your lane clear is just absurdly fast with Apollo. Whether or not the rest of the laning phase goes well is irrelevant, but I can assure you when it comes to a level 1 clear, it is very difficult to outclear an Apollo. The only gods that I can really think of to do it would be Rom with a very aggressive support, because Rom and Sylvanas, for example, or Rom and Ganesh, like Apollo is going to have a really tough time outclearing any of that unless he's with another aggressive support like a Mirror or something. But getting back to my original point, I think that So Beautiful as well. It's a line ability. It only helps to further assist you when you're looking for those auto attacks against the wave and building up your stacks of audacity. I think Apollo is also incredibly safe during a laning phase at the start because of his Serenade, the ability to mesmerize people during initial ganks. If anything, it will at least force a mid laner or a jungler who might be ganking you in that moment to use their beads, and then they might be able to be punished later on. And so that's why I also have a tendency to really like Apollo. I just think that he's incredibly safe. I think that he has a really strong early game clear, and a lot of times you can even look for the invade with Apollo because So Beautiful is a very strong ability when it comes to buff confirmation. It can be difficult for other hunters, I think, to outsecure Apollo on that one. So Apollo's going to be our third covered hunter. And those reasonings are why I like it for the laning phase. Also, you can get back to the lane really fast if you want to commit your ultimate. Across the sky is pretty good, and he does have a pretty strong dash because it does give him a little bit of a movement speed buff as he's going through. And sometimes that, even the 15% at the very start, can be all you need to survive. All right, next up, and I know some people might be expecting me to bring Izanami into the discussion, but I'm going to go ahead and cover the reasons why I don't really value Izanami for the laning phase and why you have a tendency to not see her all that often in competitive play. She's very punishable. She is super easy. Even if she clears that purple buff first and foremost, I can assure you a lot of times what will happen in Pro League play is they're not looking to beat Izanami in the level 1 lane clear. What they are looking to do is kill Izanami at level 1. You want to take a hyper aggressive dual lane, I think, against an Izanami, and you'll typically be able to punish her so much that she won't even really be able to have as much of an impact. Cyclone Spin still being one of the few pros that we have seen have success with this god on Splice, and I think that was largely due to the fact that Splice was very accommodating with their team compositions. They made sure to go heavy CC so as to provide a safety net for Cyclone. And again, I just think that while her auto attacks are super strong at clearing, she doesn't really offer too much in the way of bringing down buffs at a fast rate because even though you would expect her to be strong buff confirm, I think that there's a lot of other hunters, especially the hunters that people would probably pick against her, like Hui on her, Apollo, and the like, that are going to have an easier time pressuring out that purple buff. So that's why I'm not including Izanami for that part of the discussion. But a hunter that I think is going to be coming back for sure from the laning phase is Hutchman. Hutchman having his heavenly banner, or I think that Hutchman, that's really what he was missing, was when they nerfed his banner so that he could no longer clear, and they made it to the point where, like, even if you had it at max ranks, all 5 points put into the banner, it still wouldn't clear the wave. And so Hachiman getting, the revert on the Heavenly Banner, I think is going to make him yet another really safe laning phase hunter that is hard to go wrong with. He's got the Eagle Eye shots that can be great for extended range damage poke potential against the enemy duo lane. He's also got a dash. The Aijutsu is fantastic for both engaging or disengaging from a duo lane gank. Or if you want to be the team aggressing in the dual lane, I think Aijutsu can be fantastic setup for that because of the stun that can be applied. Heavenly Banner, of course, just safe lane clear, boosted attack speed, and the duration is a decent amount of time that you're typically going to have a pretty easy time clearing out the minions. And of course, Fall goes south. You just yeehaw on out of there with mounted archery. So all of those reasons being, I think, great examples of why Hachiman is looking to be a top tier hunter in season 6 for the laning phase. And last but not least, we've got our girl Jingwei. I bring Jingwei up into discussion as one of the hunters I want to mention for laning phase because while Jingwei might not hit the hardest in the early game, and while you might run the risk of getting your buffs invaded as well since she doesn't tend to have a whole lot of early game pressure, Jingwei is just insanely safe. It's just so hard to go wrong with Jingwei because if all else fails, all you really have to do is tower hug, and you can trust that you're not going to lose very much creep farm because Jingwei, her passive, allowing her to fly halfway back down the lane, makes it so you're missing as minimal creeps as possible in comparison to other hunters. So this passive alone is one of the main reasons why I think Jingwei is viewed so highly in the duo lane because she's just safe. Her survivability is unlike that of any other hunter. You've got persistent gust and agility that can work together to give you an extended dash away range. You've also got airstrike. when you hit level 5 that can get you up and completely out of action and out of damage at any given moment when you hit level 5. So for those three reasons, I think that Jingwei is definitely a hunter you have to include with the best laning phases hunters out there. But if you wanted a hunter outside of survivability and you wanted a hunter for pressure, there is this I wanted to distinguish with because I think that Hu Yi might actually be a hunter that rises during the laning phases in Season 6. Because, unlike Jingwei, it might not be the safest, but I think that Hu Yi with Runeforge, if Runeforge stays in its current state, I think that Hu Yi might even find himself entering the conversation. Sunbreaker is not only a great ultimate for forcing a reset on an objective, but it can also be a great team fighting tool away from objectives just to control jungle space entirely, just to control Phoenix sieging space or tower sieging space entirely, and kind of dissuade the enemy team from looking to contest. And that I think is a big team fighting ultimate that you have to factor in here for Hu Yi. He's an honorable mention. I wanna clarify this. I'll bring Hu Yi into the honorable mentions area because I think that it's impossible to have a team fighting or a laning phase breakdown discussion of hunters without involving Hu Yi because of the fact that I view his ultimate so highly. Mark of the Golden Crow as well. Great tool, or a great team fighting tool that I think a lot of pros tend to try and take advantage of because it makes his 1v1s pretty insane. And the fact that you might have a chance to stun somebody for setup is also really nice. Ricochet, when worked alongside of the Mark of the Golden Crow, you can stun somebody for up to 1 second, and obviously that's just gonna be awesome if you're trying to collapse, and that's why I think Hu Yi has to be brought into the discussion here as an honorable mention. I also think that Honor could be an honorable mention. We see him from time to time, mostly at lands, if anything, when it comes to pro play, but the reasoning that Honor is also an honorable mention is because of his impale. Impale is like just Honor just hits hard. He just hits really, really hard right now, and I think that when you get a god that does as much damage as Honor with two abilities, Impale and the Desert Fury, it's very hard to run away from that. And I think even if Honor is slightly behind in the laning phase, whether it's by as long as you're within a 2 level gap, I would say you have a fair chance of winning a 1v1 on Honor. Believe it or not, he just does a lot of damage, and Feeble as well is pretty strong. A lot of people I don't think factor in on her as passive whenever they're trying to actually look to poke him early game. And I think it's something that people should definitely look out for. Buff confirmation is also really strong thanks to Impale. He does a lot of damage. And so it can be a little bit harder, I think, to lose buffs when you have on her as your hunter. But that pretty much does it for me. I hope that this video is going to be a little bit more informative, and for anybody who's on the fence of maybe what hunters they should be trying to practice, I guess it's up to your discretion now whether you want to be more of a team fighting base or laning phase oriented hunter. As I mentioned earlier, all of these hunters that I broke down in the video, I think could in a sense intertwine between laning being strong in the laning phase and being strong in the team fighting phase. A lot of it's also going to depend, I think, around what your supports are. If you can tell it's a high clearing support, then I would probably recommend a high clearing hunter to pair alongside of that if you want to be more aggressive early on. But if you're more oriented towards mid and late game base hunters, then or team fights essentially, then that's what you're looking at the team fighting hunters for. But other than that, feel free to shoot me any questions you might have. I'll do my best to get as many responses in as possible. And I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your night.